Hey guys, tonight we descend into the shadowy, complex, and downright controversial world of black slave ownership in America, where racial identity, economic survival, and human nature collide in ways that would make modern social media debates look like polite tea parties. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to process what we're about to uncover, because what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you thought you knew about. American slavery died when most people picture slavery in America. They imagine a clear moral divide, white oppressors and black victims, with no gray area in between. That's right. The simplified version of history where good guys wear white hats and bad guys wear black ones, completely removed from the messy contradictions of human behavior. Sound familiar? It should, because it's the sanitized version of history that conveniently ignores one of the most uncomfortable truths about America's peculiar institution. Let's be clear about something that makes everyone squirm in their seats. Black people owned slaves in America. That's right. And a historical twist that would make even the most creative screenwriter pause. Some of the very people suffering under the brutal yoke of slavery were simultaneously wielding that same whip over others. And yet, if we're serious about understanding the full scope of American slavery, we can't ignore the estimated 3,700 black Americans who owned nearly 13,000 enslaved people by 1830. Of course, the reasons behind this ownership were as complex as human nature itself, ranging from desperate attempts to protect family members to calculated moves for economic advancement and social survival. Picture this. You're scrolling through Colonial, America's version of LinkedIn, and you come across a profile that would break your brain. Anthony Johnson, successful tobacco farmer, property owner, and, wait for it, slave owner. Meanwhile, Anthony Johnson himself had arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant in 1621, worked his way to freedom, and by the 1650s owned 250 acres and several enslaved people. If you thought the American dream was complicated in the 21st century, think again. The story of black slave ownership doesn't begin with some moral failing or historical aberration. It begins with survival, opportunity, and the twisted logic of a society that measured human worth in property and productivity. Let's be honest, when your entire existence depends on navigating a system designed to crush you, you learn to work within that system's rules. No matter how perverse they might be dawed by the early 1600s, the lines between indentured servitude and slavery weren't as clearly drawn as they would later become. Still, the seeds of racial hierarchy were already being planted in the fertile soil of economic exploitation. Anthony Johnson and his contemporaries found themselves in a unique position. They had achieved something extraordinary by gaining their freedom. They existed in a world where that freedom was constantly under threat. To be fair, Johnson's rise wasn't exactly a rags-to-riches fairy tale. After completing his indenture, he married Mary, another formerly indentured servant, and together they began the painstaking process of building wealth in a society that viewed their very existence as an anomaly. That's right, while most black people were being systematically enslaved, a small number were playing by the colonists' rules so effectively that they became part of the oppressor class, themselves. The Virginia of the 1640s and 1650s was a place where racial boundaries were more fluid than they would later become, but economic boundaries were absolutely rigid. And yet, Johnson managed to navigate this treacherous landscape with remarkable skill. When a fire destroyed his plantation in 1653, the local court actually granted him tax relief, a courtesy rarely extended to black property owners in later periods. Of course, Johnson's success story comes with a massive asterisk. His ability to own enslaved people was directly tied to his ability to protect his own family's freedom. In a legal system that was rapidly moving toward the total enslavement of black people, owning property, including human property, became a form of Insurance against enslavement. Meanwhile, in other colonies, different patterns were emerging. In Louisiana, the complex system of plaquage created a class of free people of color who often accumulated significant wealth and, yes, enslaved people. These were typically the mixed-race children of white planters and enslaved women who occupied a strange middle ground in the racial hierarchy. Sound familiar? It's the classic American story of climbing the ladder while the ladder itself is built on someone else's back. But let's be clear. Judging these individuals by modern standards misses the point entirely. They were operating within a system that gave them few options, and they chose the options that best ensured their survival and that of their families. By 1790, census records show that free black people owned enslaved people in every state that permitted slavery. The numbers were small, rarely more than a handful per owner, but their existence challenges our understanding of how oppressive systems actually function. That's right. Even within the most dehumanizing institution in American history, there were people who managed to climb from the bottom to somewhere near the middle, often by stepping on others who looked just like them. The early patterns established in Virginia spread throughout the colonies as the legal framework of slavery hardened. If you thought the moral complexity of slavery couldn't get any more twisted, consider this. Some of the most successful free black families in colonial America built their wealth on the same foundation as their white neighbors: the ownership and exploitation of other human beings. Still, we need to understand that these early black slave owners weren't operating in a vacuum. They were responding to specific economic incentives and social pressures that made slave ownership not just profitable, but often necessary for maintaining their precarious position in colonial society. To be fair, when your alternative is potential re-enslavement or economic ruin, the moral calculus becomes significantly more complicated. The transformation from indentured servitude to racial slavery happened gradually, but by the early 1700s, the die was cast. White indentured servants could eventually blend into the general population and escape their past, but black Americans, regardless of their legal status, carried their racial identity as both a burden and a target. And yet, some managed to turn even this disadvantage into a strategic advantage by becoming so successful within the system that they became indispensable to white society. Meanwhile, the legal framework continued to evolve in ways that made black slave ownership both more difficult and more necessary. Laws restricting free black movement, property rights, and economic activities meant that those who had already achieved success had to work even harder to maintain it. Of course, one of the most effective ways to demonstrate your commitment to the existing social order was to participate in it fully, including the ownership of enslaved people. By the time of the American Revolution, the pattern was well established. Free black Americans who wanted to succeed economically often had little choice but to engage with the institution of slavery, either as owners themselves or as intermediaries in the slave trade. That's right, the very system designed to oppress then became, for some, a vehicle for advancement. If you thought the ironies ended there, think again. Some black slave owners even fought alongside white colonists in the Revolutionary War, defending a system of liberty that explicitly excluded most people who looked like them. The cognitive dissonance required to navigate such contradictions speaks to the incredible adaptability of human beings under extreme pressure. And yet, for all the moral complexity, we can't lose sight of the fact that these early black slave owners were pioneers in their own right. They proved that black Americans could succeed economically when given the opportunity, even within a system designed to prevent that success. Still, their success came at a cost that resonates through American history to this day. Let's be honest about something that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. By 1830, there were more black slave owners in America than there were signers of the Declaration of Independence. That's right, while 56 white men put their names on that famous document declaring that all men are created equal. Approximately 3,700 black Americans owned nearly 13,000 enslaved people across the United States. To be fair, these numbers don't tell the whole story, but they do tell us that black slave ownership wasn't some rare historical anomaly. It was a documented, measurable phenomenon that existed in every slave state, and even some free ones. Sound familiar? It's the kind of statistical reality that complicates our neat narratives about American history. Meanwhile, let's put these numbers in perspective. The total enslaved population in 1830 was approximately 2 million people, which means black slave owners held less than 1% of all enslaved Americans. Of course, that's still 13,000 human beings whose lives were controlled by people who shared their racial identity and, in many cases, their own experiences of oppression. By region, the distribution was fascinating and revealing. South Carolina led the pack with the highest number of black slave owners, followed by Louisiana, Virginia, and Maryland. If you thought this was evenly distributed across the South, think again. The concentration in specific areas tells us something important about where and how free black communities developed economic power. In Charleston, South Carolina, the 1830 census recorded 402 free black people who owned 965 enslaved people among them. That's right, in a single city, there were more black slave owners than in entire states elsewhere. The average was about 2.4 enslaved people per black owner, but some owned considerably more. And yet, even these relatively modest numbers represent thousands of individual human tragedies and moral compromises. Let's be clear about what these statistics really mean. When we talk about William Ellison of South Carolina, we're not discussing some minor historical footnote. By 1860, Ellison owned 63 enslaved people and was worth more than $65,000, making him wealthier than 90% of white Americans at the time. Meanwhile, most black slave owners held between 1 and 5 people, suggesting very different motivations and circumstances. To be fair, the largest group of black slave owners held only 1 or 2 people, and census records strongly suggest these were family members purchased to prevent their sale to others. Still, the existence of black Americans like Ellison, who operated large plantations with dozens of enslaved workers, proves that some were playing the game of slavery for purely economic reasons. Of course, the numbers varied dramatically by state and region. In Virginia, most black slave owners lived in urban areas like Richmond and Norfolk, where they often ran businesses that required additional labor. That's right. While plantation slavery gets most of the historical attention, urban slavery was where many black Americans found their entry point into slave ownership. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, the unique 3-caste system created opportunities for gens de couleur libres, free people of color, to accumulate substantial wealth and property, including enslaved people. By 1840, New Orleans had one of the largest populations of wealthy free black Americans in the country, many of whom owned enslaved workers for their businesses and plantations. If you thought these numbers stayed constant over time, think again. The population of black slave owners actually grew significantly between 1790 and 1860, even as laws restricting free black rights became increasingly harsh. Sound familiar? It's the classic pattern of a minority group achieving economic success even as the broader society becomes more hostile. And yet, we need to be careful about how we interpret these statistics. The raw numbers don't tell us about motivations, treatment, or the complex family relationships that often define black slave ownership. Still, they do tell us that this wasn't a marginal phenomenon. It was significant enough to appear in census records across multiple states and decades. By 1860, the last census before the Civil War, Black slave ownership had reached its peak. Let's be honest, if the war hadn't intervened, these numbers probably would have continued growing as more free Black Americans found economic success within the system. To be fair, this growth was happening even as legal restrictions on free Black Americans were becoming increasingly severe. The regional variations tell us something important about how slavery functioned as an economic system. In areas with large, free Black populations and more economic opportunities, slave ownership was more common. Meanwhile, in areas where free Black Americans faced greater legal restrictions, slave ownership was often impossible regardless of economic capability. Of course, these statistics don't capture the full complexity of Black slave ownership. Census records can't tell us whether an enslaved person listed as property was actually a family member being protected or a worker being exploited. That's right. The same statistical category could represent completely different human relationships and moral calculations. Still, the numbers do reveal something profound about American society in the antebellum period. And yet, despite the statistical reality of Black slave ownership, it remained largely invisible in contemporary white discourse about slavery. If you thought white Americans would use these examples to justify slavery by pointing to Black participation, you'd be partially right, but mostly they simply ignored it. The urban versus rural divide in these statistics is particularly revealing. In cities like New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond, Black slave ownership was concentrated among skilled craftsmen, small business owners, and service providers who needed additional labor. Meanwhile, rural Black slave owners were more likely to be farmers who had managed to accumulate enough wealth to purchase land and workers. To be fair, these numbers represent both the success of individual Black Americans and the moral compromises required by an immoral system. Sound familiar? It's the eternal American tension between individual advancement and collective responsibility, played out in its most extreme form. By the time of the Civil War, the statistical reality of Black slave ownership had created a unique class of Americans who were simultaneously part of an oppressed racial group and members of the oppressor class. Let's be clear, this wasn't a contradiction that existed only on paper. It created real tensions within free Black communities and complicated relationships between enslaved and free Black Americans. And yet, for all the statistical significance, Black slave ownership remained a minority phenomenon, even within free Black communities. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Black Americans remained enslaved, and even most free Black Americans never owned enslaved people. Of course, this doesn't diminish the historical importance of those who did, but it does provide essential context for understanding the broader Black experience in antebellum America. Let's be clear about something that's going to challenge every assumption you have about slavery. Not all Black slave owners were driven by the same motivations, and those motivations were often as complex as human nature itself. That's right. While it would be convenient to paint them all with the same brush, either as heroes protecting family or villains exploiting their own people, the reality is far messier and more interesting. To be fair, the most common motivation was probably the most heartbreaking: family protection. Sound familiar? It's the same instinct that drives parents today to make enormous sacrifices for their children. Except these parents were operating in a system where buying your own family members was often the only way to keep them safe. Meanwhile, let's talk about someone like Dilsey Pope of Georgia, who purchased her own husband from his owner in 1820. Pope worked as a laundress for years, saving every penny she could, just to buy the man she loved and prevent him from being sold away. Of course, under Georgia law, she couldn't simply free him. Manumission was severely restricted, so he remained legally her property until his death. If you thought romantic love was complicated in the 21st century, imagine having to literally own your spouse to protect them. And yet, family protection wasn't always straightforward. Consider the case of John Carruthers Stanley of North Carolina, who owned several family members but refused to free them even when he had the legal ability to do so. Stanley argued that they were better off as his slaves than as free black people in a hostile society. That's right. He made the paternalistic calculation that ownership was protection, a logic that white slave owners had been using for centuries. Still, we can't dismiss Stanley's reasoning entirely. By the 1820s and 1830s, laws restricting free black Americans had become so harsh in many states that freedom could indeed be more dangerous than slavery under a protective owner. Of course, this created the perverse situation where some black Americans kept their own family members enslaved as a form of insurance against worse treatment by white owners. Let's be honest about the second major motivation: economic advancement. For some black Americans, slave ownership wasn't about family protection at all. It was about climbing the economic ladder in the only way available to them. Take William Ellison of South Carolina, who built a gin-making business that eventually required dozens of workers. Meanwhile, Ellison treated his enslaved workers much like any other plantation owner would, prioritizing profit over compassion. To be fair, Ellison's success story is both inspiring and disturbing. He proved that black Americans could compete economically with white entrepreneurs when given the opportunity, but he did so by exploiting other black Americans. Sound familiar? It's the classic American narrative of individual success built on collective exploitation, except with the added complexity of racial identity. Of course, economic motivations weren't always about personal enrichment. Some black slave owners used their wealth strategically to gain influence within white society, believing that economic success would provide protection for their families and communities. That's right. They were playing a long game where slave ownership was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And yet, this strategy was always precarious. Marie-Thérèse Coincoin of Louisiana built a successful plantation empire in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But her wealth couldn't protect her descendants from the increasing legal restrictions on free people of color. If you thought money could buy safety in a racist society, her story proves otherwise. Meanwhile, let's talk about social acceptance as a motivation. In some communities, particularly in Louisiana and South Carolina, owning enslaved people was a marker of respectability and social status. Free black Americans who wanted to be accepted by white society, or at least tolerated by it, and often felt pressure to demonstrate their commitment to the existing social order. This is where things get really complicated. Some black slave owners were essentially performing whiteness, adopting the behaviors and attitudes of the white elite in hopes of being accepted or at least left alone. Still, this performance often required them to treat enslaved people, including sometimes their own family members, with the same callousness that white owners displayed. Let's be clear about another uncomfortable motivation: survival. In many cases, owning enslaved people wasn't a choice at all. It was a necessity forced by legal and economic circumstances. When laws prevented free black Americans from certain occupations or restricted their movements, slave ownership sometimes provided the only viable path to economic stability. To be fair, survival motivations could take many forms. Some black Americans inherited enslaved people and found themselves trapped in a system they couldn't escape without losing their own economic security. Meanwhile, others purchased enslaved people as investments, viewing them as the most reliable store of wealth available to black Americans in an unstable economic environment. Of course, we also need to acknowledge the motivation of revenge or power. Some black Americans who had experienced the trauma of slavery themselves may have been attracted to the idea of wielding power over others. That's right. The cycle of oppression sometimes created oppressors, even within the oppressed community itself. And yet, this motivation was probably less common than we might expect. Most black slave owners had ongoing connections to enslaved communities and understood intimately the suffering that slavery caused. Still, the psychological appeal of moving from powerlessness to power shouldn't be underestimated as a factor in some cases. Meanwhile, let's talk about business necessity as a motivation. Many free black Americans worked in occupations that required additional labor: carpentry, blacksmithing, farming, domestic service. If you thought they could simply hire free workers, think again. In many areas, hiring free black or white workers was either legally restricted or economically unfeasible. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that drives modern businesses to make morally questionable decisions based on economic necessity. Of course, this doesn't excuse the practice, but it helps us understand how good people can make terrible choices when operating within corrupt systems. To be fair, some black slave owners genuinely believed they were providing better treatment than white owners would. They saw themselves as protectors rather than exploiters, creating what they believed were more humane conditions for people who would be enslaved regardless. And yet, this paternalistic attitude was identical to the justifications used by white slave owners. Still, the evidence suggests that motivation often determined treatment. Black slave owners who were motivated by family protection generally treated their enslaved people better than those motivated purely by profit. Meanwhile, those motivated by social acceptance often adopted the harsh treatment patterns of white society to prove their respectability. Let's be honest about the most complex motivation of all: genuine affection combined with legal impossibility. Many black Americans wanted to free family members they had purchased, but found themselves trapped by laws that prevented manumission or required free people to leave the state. Of course, this created the heartbreaking situation where love required ownership. By the 1850s, these legal restrictions had become so severe in many states that purchasing family members was often the only way to keep families together. If you thought the system was designed to create these moral dilemmas, you'd be absolutely right. Meanwhile, black Americans found themselves forced to participate in the very system that oppressed them, not out of greed or callousness, but out of love and desperation. Let's be honest about something that's going to make everyone uncomfortable. Black slave owners ran the full spectrum from benevolent protectors to ruthless exploiters. And sometimes, the same person could be both depending on the circumstances. That's right. If you were hoping for a simple narrative about how shared racial experience automatically created compassion, prepare to have your assumptions thoroughly challenged. To be fair, the most common pattern among black slave owners was what we might call protective ownership, purchasing family members to keep them safe and treating them more as dependents than as property. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that drives modern parents to make financial decisions for adult children, except with the added horror of legal ownership. Meanwhile, let's talk about someone like Dilsey Pope, the Georgia laundress who bought her husband. Contemporary accounts suggest that Pope treated her husband more like a partner than property, but she still had to maintain the legal fiction of ownership to protect him from being claimed by creditors or hostile whites. Of course, this created the daily psychological torture of pretending to own someone you actually loved as an equal. And yet, even protective ownership came with genuine constraints and controls. Black slave owners who were protecting family members still had to maintain discipline and obedience to make the arrangement credible to white society. That's right. Love required performance of dominance, creating a psychological minefield for everyone involved. Still, the evidence suggests that family-motivated black slave owners generally provided better living conditions, more freedom of movement, and greater opportunities for education and skill development than typical white owners. If you thought this was universally true, think again. Some black owners were so paranoid about maintaining their cover that they treated family members even more harshly than strangers. Let's be clear about the other end of the spectrum. Black slave owners who operated purely for profit often treated their enslaved workers with the same calculated cruelty as their white counterparts. Take William Ellison of South Carolina, whose plantation records show a systematic approach to maximizing productivity through a combination of incentives and punishments that differed little from white-owned plantations. Ellison's treatment of his enslaved workers was particularly interesting because it revealed how completely he had internalized the logic of slavery as a business enterprise. Meanwhile, his success depended on proving to white society that he could control black labor as effectively as any white planter. Of course, this meant that his enslaved workers couldn't expect mercy based on shared racial experience thought to be fair. Ellison wasn't unusual in this regard. Black slave owners who operated large-scale agricultural or manufacturing enterprises generally adopted the same harsh treatment patterns as white owners because the economic incentives were identical. Sound familiar? It's the eternal tension between individual advancement and group solidarity, played out in its most extreme form. Of course, treatment patterns also varied significantly based on the type of work involved. Urban black slave owners who used enslaved people in skilled trades often provided better working conditions and more opportunities for advancement than rural plantation owners. That's right. The nature of the work often mattered more than the race of the owner. And yet, urban slavery and the black ownership came with its own unique complications. Enslaved people working for black owners in cities often had more contact with free black communities, which could create psychological tensions about their status. Meanwhile, they might have greater opportunities to earn money or develop skills, but they also faced the daily reminder that people who looked like them had achieved freedom. Let's talk about the regional variations in treatment patterns. In Louisiana, where the three-caste system created a large population of wealthy free people of color, treatment of enslaved people by black owners often followed the patterns established by white Creole society. This meant a complex system of privileges and restrictions based on skin color, family connections, and individual circumstances. Meanwhile, in South Carolina and Georgia, where laws governing slavery were particularly harsh, black slave owners often had less flexibility in how they treated their enslaved people. If you thought regional differences in white treatment of slaves were significant, the variations among black owners were even more pronounced. Still, we need to acknowledge that some black slave owners developed genuine innovations in slave management that reflected their unique position in the racial hierarchy. Some created systems of shared labor and profit sharing that were virtually unknown on white-owned plantations. Of course, these arrangements were always precarious and depended on maintaining secrecy from white authorities. To be fair, the most psychologically complex treatment patterns occurred when black owners held family members who couldn't legally be freed. These relationships often involved elaborate performances of dominance and submission in public, followed by equality or even deference in private. Sound familiar? It's like method acting, except the performance was literally a matter of life and death. And yet, even these protective relationships could become genuinely oppressive over time. Some black owners who initially purchased family members for protection gradually began to see them as actual property, especially as economic pressures increased. That's right. The system was so pervasive that it could corrupt even the most loving relationships. Let's be honest about physical treatment. The evidence suggests that black slave owners were less likely to use extreme physical punishment than white owners, but they weren't immune to violence as a form of control. Meanwhile, They faced the additional challenge of maintaining authority without the racial hierarchy that white owners could rely on. Of course, this often meant that black slave owners had to be more creative in their methods of control. Some relied heavily on economic incentives, others on psychological manipulation, and still others on appeals to family loyalty or racial solidarity. If you thought these methods were necessarily more humane than physical coercion, the historical record suggests otherwise. Still, there's evidence that enslaved people generally preferred black owners to white ones, even when treatment was similar. This preference seems to have been based on a belief that black owners were more likely to understand their experiences and more amenable to negotiation and compromise. Meanwhile, the reality was often more complex than these preferences suggested. And yet, we can't ignore the accounts of enslaved people who described their black owners as being among the cruelest masters they experienced. Some of these accounts suggest that black owners felt pressure to prove their authority by being even harsher than white owners. That's right, the performance of power sometimes required real cruelty, regardless of personal feelings or racial solidarity. Let's be clear about working conditions. Black slave owners who operated businesses often provided better working conditions than agricultural plantations. But this was more about the nature of skilled labor than about compassionate treatment. Meanwhile, they still expected the same long hours and intense productivity that characterized slavery everywhere. To be fair, some black slave owners did provide opportunities for enslaved people to develop skills, earn money, or even purchase their own freedom. These arrangements were particularly common in urban areas where the economic benefits of skilled, motivated workers were most apparent. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that drives modern businesses to invest in employee development, except within the context of human ownership. Of course, these opportunities were always conditional and could be revoked at any time. And yet, they represented genuine possibilities for advancement that were rare under white ownership. Meanwhile, they also created complicated relationships of gratitude and resentment that persisted long after emancipation. By the 1850s, treatment patterns among black slave owners had generally hardened along the same lines as white ownership. If you thought shared racial experience would prevent this evolution, the historical record proves otherwise. Still, even the harshest black owners typically provided better living conditions and more opportunities for family relationships than their white counterparts, suggesting that some elements of compassion persisted even within the most corrupted relationships. Let's be clear about something. The best way to understand the complexity of black slave ownership is through the individual stories of the people who lived it. That's right. Behind all those statistics and regional patterns are human beings who made impossible choices in an impossible system. And their stories are far more complicated than any Hollywood movie would dare to portray. To be fair, we need to start with the most successful and controversial black slave owner in American history, William Ellison of South Carolina. Born into slavery around 1790 as April, he learned the gin-making trade from his master and eventually purchased his freedom in 1816. Meanwhile, he changed his name to William Ellison, taking the surname from his former master, and set up shop as a cotton gin manufacturer in the Sumter district. And yet, Ellison's rise to prominence came at a cost that still makes historians uncomfortable. By 1860, he owned 63 enslaved people and was worth more than $65,000, making him wealthier than 90% of white Americans. If you thought he achieved this success through kindness and fair treatment, think again. Plantation records show that Ellison operated his cotton plantation with the same ruthless efficiency as any white planter. Sound familiar? It's the classic American success story, except the protagonist achieved his dreams by enslaving people who looked exactly like him. Of course, Allison's defenders argue that he was simply playing by the rules of a system he didn't create, but his critics point out that he played those rules better than most white people. Meanwhile, let's talk about Marie-Thérèse Coincoin of Louisiana, whose story reads like something out of a fever dream. Born into slavery around 1742, she became the concubine of a French merchant named Claude Thomas Pierre Menoyer. Still, when Metoyer decided to return to France, he freed Marie-Thérèse and their children, giving her a substantial tract of land along the Cane River. What Marie-Thérèse did next was remarkable. She built a business empire that included multiple plantations and dozens of enslaved workers. That's right, a woman who had been born into slavery became one of the largest slave owners in Louisiana. By the time of her death in 1816, her descendants controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people, creating what was essentially a black dynasty in the antebellum South. To be fair, Marie-Thérèse's treatment of her enslaved workers appears to have been relatively benevolent by the standards of the time. Contemporary accounts suggest she provided better housing, food, and working conditions than most white planters. And yet, she was still buying and selling human beings to build her wealth. And some of those human beings were her own relatives. Let's be honest about Anthony Johnson of Virginia, whose story gets taught in schools as an example of early black success, but usually leaves out the uncomfortable details. Johnson arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant in 1621, worked his way to freedom, and by the 1650s owned 250 acres and several enslaved people. Meanwhile, he was involved in one of the first legal cases that established the precedent for lifelong slavery based on race. Of course, Johnson's most famous legal victory came when he sued to recover one of his enslaved workers, John Cassar, who had claimed to be an indentured servant rather than a slave. The Virginia court ruled in Johnson's favor, establishing that Cassar was Johnson's property for life. If you thought this was just about property rights, think again. This case helped cement the legal framework that would enslave millions of black Americans for the next 2 centuries. And yet, Johnson's story is also one of remarkable resilience and adaptability. When a fire destroyed his plantation in 1653, the local court granted him tax relief, a courtesy rarely extended to black property owners. Still, by the 1670s, as racial laws hardened, even Johnson's success couldn't protect his family from discrimination and eventual displacement. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, we have the story of Tommy Laffin, who became one of the wealthiest men in Louisiana through real estate speculation and money lending. Born free in 1810, Laffin owned several enslaved people who worked in his various business enterprises. Sound familiar? He was essentially running the 19th century equivalent of a private equity firm, except some of his assets were human beings. To be fair, Laffin was known for his philanthropy and support of education for free people of color. He funded schools, orphanages, and churches throughout New Orleans. And yet, his wealth was built, at least partially, on the labor of enslaved people. That's right. Even his charitable giving was tainted by the moral compromises required to succeed in a slave-based economy. Let's talk about Dilsey Pope of Georgia, whose story represents the most heartbreaking aspect of black slave ownership. Pope worked as a laundress in Savannah, saving every penny for years to purchase her husband's freedom. Of course, Georgia law prevented her from actually freeing him, so he remained legally her property until his death. Contemporary accounts describe Pope as treating her husband more like a partner than property, but she still had to maintain the legal fiction of ownership. Meanwhile, she had to watch other enslaved people being bought and sold in the same marketplace where she had purchased the man she loved. If you thought this arrangement was psychologically sustainable, court records show that Pope struggled with depression and anxiety throughout her life. Still, Pope's story illustrates the most common motivation for black slave ownership: family protection. And yet, even this noble motivation created genuine moral conflicts. When Pope's husband became ill and couldn't work, she had to decide whether to hire him out to other employers or support him entirely from her own earnings. That's right. Even love became a business calculation within the system of slavery. Of course, we can't ignore the story of John Carruthers Stanley of North Carolina, whose approach to family ownership was far more complicated. Stanley owned several of his own family members, but refused to free them, arguing that they were safer as his slaves than as free black people in an increasingly hostile society. Meanwhile, he accumulated substantial wealth through barbering and real estate speculation. And yet, Stanley's paternalistic control over his family members was virtually indistinguishable from the attitudes of white slave owners. He made decisions about their marriages, occupations, and living arrangements without their input. If you thought family bonds would prevent such control, Stanley's story proves otherwise. Let's be honest about Cyprien Ricard of Louisiana, who inherited enslaved people from his white father and built them into a plantation empire of nearly 100 workers. Ricard's treatment of his enslaved people was reportedly harsh, with frequent use of physical punishment and strict work requirements. That's right. He proved that shared racial experience was no guarantee of compassionate treatment. To be fair, Ricard operated in a competitive agricultural market where success required maximizing productivity. Still, former enslaved people from his plantation described him as being as cruel as any white master they had experienced. Meanwhile, he used his wealth to gain acceptance in white society, even joining the local militia unit. Meanwhile, the story of Jacques Tinchant of New Orleans represents the pinnacle of black economic success in the antebellum period. Tinchant built a business empire that included real estate, shipping, and slave trading. That's right. He didn't just own enslaved people. He bought and sold them as a primary business activity. Sound familiar? Tinchant was essentially running a human resources company, except the resources were literally human beings. And yet, he was also a patron of the arts, a supporter of education, and a respected member of New Orleans' free-colored community. Of course, his respectability was built on the suffering of others who shared his racial identity. By the time of the Civil War, these individual stories had created a small but significant class of black Americans, whose interests were aligned with the preservation of slavery. If you thought the war would automatically unite all black Americans against the institution, the reality was far more complicated. Still, most black slave owners ultimately supported the Union cause, recognizing that their own freedom was tied to the abolition of the entire system. Let's be honest about something that makes everyone squirm. Judging black slave owners by modern moral standards is like critiquing someone's survival choices during a zombie apocalypse from the comfort of your living room. That's right. These people were operating within a system so fundamentally corrupt that every choice available to them was morally compromised in some way. To be fair, the easiest moral case to understand is family protection. When Dilsey Pope worked for years to buy her husband, or when parents purchased their own children to prevent their sale to cruel masters, we can see the love and desperation behind these decisions. Sound familiar? It's the same instinct that drives modern parents to make enormous sacrifices for their families, except the sacrifice involved participating in humanity's greatest moral crime. Meanwhile, let's talk about the impossible legal framework that created these moral dilemmas. In many states, particularly by the 1830s and 1840s, manumission laws were so restrictive that purchasing a family member was often the only way to protect them. Of course, this meant that love literally required ownership, creating a psychological nightmare for everyone involved. And yet, even family protection cases weren't morally straightforward. Consider John Carruthers Stanley of North Carolina, who owned his own family members but refused to free them when it became legally possible. Stanley argued, using the same paternalistic logic as white slave owners, that his family was better off under his protection than facing the world as free. Black people in an increasingly hostile society. If you thought Stanley was obviously wrong, consider the evidence. By the 1850s, laws restricting free black Americans had become so harsh that freedom could indeed be more dangerous than slavery. Under a protective owner. That's right. The system was so thoroughly corrupted that slavery could sometimes be the safer option for black Americans. Still, we can't ignore the voices of enslaved people themselves, many of whom rejected this paternalistic logic even when it came from black owners. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about the psychological damage caused by enslaved people being told that their bondage was for their own good, regardless of who was doing the telling. Let's be clear about the economic advancement cases, which present even thornier moral questions. When William Ellison built his gin-making business into a plantation empire, was he proving that black Americans could succeed economically, or was he simply exploiting other black Americans for personal gain? Meanwhile, his success undoubtedly provided ammunition for white supremacists who could point to his example as proof that slavery wasn't inherently racist. To be fair, Ellison operated in an economic system where slave labor was not just normal, but virtually required for agricultural success. Of course, this doesn't excuse his choices, but it helps us understand how someone could rationalize participating in an immoral system. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that allows modern consumers to buy products made with sweatshop labor, while maintaining their moral self-image. And yet, the comparison only goes so far. Ellison wasn't just a passive consumer of an unjust system. He was an active participant who built his wealth through the direct exploitation of other human beings. That's right. He crossed the line from victim of the system to perpetrator within it. And that crossing carries moral weight regardless of the circumstances. Meanwhile, we need to acknowledge the unique psychological pressures faced by black slave owners. They had to maintain authority over people who shared their racial identity and often their personal experiences of oppression. This required a level of cognitive dissonance that must have been psychologically devastating for all involved. Of course, some black slave owners seem to have resolved this cognitive dissonance by fully adopting the racial hierarchies of white society. They treated their enslaved workers not as fellow black Americans, but as inferior beings who deserved their fate. If you thought shared racial experience would prevent such attitudes, the historical record proves otherwise. Still, the evidence suggests that most black slave owners never fully escaped the moral tensions of their position. Court records, personal letters, and contemporary accounts reveal ongoing struggles with guilt, anxiety, and depression among black slave owners, particularly those who owned family members they couldn't legally free. Let's talk about the community dynamics that shaped these moral calculations. Free black communities were often divided about slave ownership, with some members supporting it as a survival strategy and others condemning it as a betrayal of racial solidarity. Meanwhile, these debates created lasting divisions within black communities that persisted long after emancipation. To be fair, these community tensions reflected genuine disagreements about survival strategies rather than simple moral clarity. In a society designed to crush black Americans, different people chose different paths to survival and advancement. And yet, these choices had consequences that extended far beyond individual families. The religious dimensions of these moral dilemmas add another layer of complexity. Many black slave owners were deeply religious Christians who struggled to reconcile their faith with their participation in slavery. Some found theological justifications for their actions, while others lived with the constant burden of what they saw as necessary sign. Sound familiar? It's the eternal human struggle between practical necessity and moral idealism, played out in its most extreme form. Meanwhile, white slave owners face similar theological challenges but could rely on elaborate racial hierarchies to justify their actions. Black slave owners had no such comfortable rationalizations available. Of course, we also need to consider the impact of these moral compromises on the enslaved people themselves. Being owned by someone who shared your racial identity created unique psychological pressures and often intensified feelings of betrayal and abandonment. That's right. The very similarity that might have created empathy often made the experience of enslavement more psychologically damaging. And yet, many enslaved people reported preferring black owners to white ones, even when treatment was similar. This preference seems to have been based on a belief that black owners were more likely to understand their experiences and more amenable to negotiation. Meanwhile, the reality was often more complex than these preferences suggested. Let's be honest about the long-term consequences of these moral compromises. Black slave ownership created precedents and patterns that influenced post-emancipation labor relations, particularly in the South. Some former black slave owners became employers of former enslaved people, maintaining exploitative relationships under new legal frameworks. Still, we need to acknowledge that moral judgment is complicated by historical context. The choices available to black Americans in the antebellum period were severely constrained by legal, economic, and social pressures. If you thought there were always clear moral alternatives available, the historical record suggests otherwise. To be fair, this doesn't mean we should excuse or ignore the moral problems with black slave ownership. Rather, it means we need to understand these choices within their proper context, while still acknowledging their moral weight. Meanwhile, we can recognize the impossible circumstances that created these dilemmas while still holding people accountable for their choices. And yet, perhaps the most important moral lesson from black slave ownership is how thoroughly corrupt systems can compromise even their victims. The institution of slavery was so pervasive and powerful that it could turn oppressed people into oppressors, victims into perpetrators. Of course, this doesn't excuse individual choices, but it does illustrate the systemic nature of moral corruption. By the 1850s, these moral tensions had reached a breaking point for many black slave owners. The increasingly harsh legal restrictions on free black Americans made their position ever more precarious, while the growing abolitionist movement forced them to confront the contradictions in their situation. If you thought the Civil War resolved these moral dilemmas, think again. Many of these tensions persisted long after emancipation. Let's be clear about something that's going to complicate every generalization you might want to make about black slave ownership. The experience varied so dramatically by region that we're essentially talking about different phenomena that happen to share the same legal framework. That's right. A black slave owner in New Orleans operated in a completely different world from one in rural Virginia or urban Charleston. To be fair, Louisiana represents perhaps the most complex and developed system of black slave ownership in the antebellum South. The state's unique three-caste system-wide, free people of color, and enslaved created opportunities for wealth accumulation that were virtually unknown elsewhere. Meanwhile, the French and Spanish colonial heritage had established legal precedents for free people of color that persisted even after American takeover. In New Orleans specifically, the concentration of wealthy free people of color was extraordinary. By 1840, the city contained some of the richest black Americans in the country, many of whom owned substantial numbers of enslaved people. Sound familiar? It was like having a parallel society where racial hierarchies existed but weren't absolute barriers to advancement. And yet, even in Louisiana, the system was built on fundamental contradictions. Free people of color could own enslaved people and accumulate substantial wealth, but they couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, and faced increasing legal restrictions as the antebellum period progressed. Of course, this created a class of people who were simultaneously privileged and oppressed, successful and vulnerable. Meanwhile, let's talk about South Carolina, where black slave ownership followed very different patterns. The state had the highest concentration of black slave owners in the country, but most were small-scale operators rather than large planters. Charleston's free black community included skilled craftsmen, small business owners, and service providers, who typically owned 1 to 5 enslaved people for their enterprises. Still, South Carolina also produced some of the most successful black planters, like William Ellison, whose operations rivaled those of white plantation owners. If you thought this success would earn them acceptance in white society, think again. South Carolina's racial laws became increasingly harsh throughout the antebellum period, restricting even the wealthiest free black Americans. To be fair, the low-country culture of South Carolina created unique opportunities for black advancement. The rice-growing region had a long tradition of enslaved people maintaining their own economic activities, and some eventually parlayed these skills into freedom and business ownership. Meanwhile, the complex task system used in rice cultivation created opportunities for entrepreneurship that didn't exist in other crops. Of course, Virginia presents yet another pattern entirely. The state's black slave owners were concentrated primarily in urban areas like Richmond, Norfolk, and Petersburg, where they operated businesses that served both black and white communities. That's right, while plantation slavery dominated the rural areas, urban slavery created niches where black Americans could accumulate wealth and property. And yet, Virginia's black slave owners faced unique challenges because the state was the birthplace of American slavery and had the most developed legal framework for controlling free black Americans. By the 1840s and 1850s, Virginia's laws had become so restrictive that even successful black business owners lived under constant threat of re-enslavement or deportation. Let's be honest about Maryland, where proximity to free states created both opportunities and dangers for black slave owners. The state's location made it easier for enslaved people to escape, which meant that slave owners, black and white alike, had to be more vigilant about control. Meanwhile, the threat of escape also created opportunities for black Americans to negotiate better terms of bondage or eventual freedom. Sound familiar? Maryland was essentially a border state before there were official border states, creating a complex environment where freedom and slavery existed in close proximity. Still, this proximity also meant that black slave owners in Maryland faced constant pressure from abolitionists who viewed their participation in slavery as particularly hypocritical. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, black slave ownership was primarily concentrated in urban areas and among mixed-race families who had inherited property from white relatives. The state's laws were somewhat less restrictive than South Carolina's, but they still limited the activities and movements of free black Americans significantly. To be fair, North Carolina's approach to free people of color was pragmatic rather than ideological. The state needed skilled workers and small business owners, so it tolerated black success as long as it didn't challenge white supremacy directly. Of course, this tolerance was always conditional and could be revoked whenever white interests demanded it. If you thought Georgia would follow similar patterns, think again. The state's black slave owners were primarily concentrated in Savannah and Augusta, and most owned only 1 or 2 people, usually family members they were protecting. Georgia's laws governing free black Americans were among the harshest in the South, making wealth accumulation extremely difficult. And yet, even in Georgia, some black Americans managed to achieve remarkable success. The state's skilled craftsmen, particularly in shipbuilding and carpentry, could earn substantial incomes and sometimes parlay these skills into business ownership. Still, their success was always precarious and subject to wide approval. Let's talk about the unique situation in Washington, D.C., where black slave ownership existed within the nation's capital. The city's status as a federal district created legal ambiguities that some black Americans exploited to their advantage. Meanwhile, the concentration of government officials and diplomats created a market for skilled services that some black entrepreneurs successfully entered. Of course, the irony of slavery existing in the capital of a nation founded on principles of liberty wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Black slave owners in D.C. had to navigate not just local racial hierarchies, but also national political debates about slavery's future. That's right. They were literally at the center of the country's greatest moral and political crisis. Meanwhile, the few black slave owners in border states like Kentucky and Tennessee faced unique challenges because their neighbors included both pro-slavery and anti-slavery whites. This divided environment meant that black slave ownership was more controversial and more closely scrutinized than in the Deep South. Still, border state black slave owners often had more opportunities to free their enslaved people legally, which created different moral calculations than in states where manumission was severely restricted. To be fair, this greater legal flexibility sometimes made their continued participation in slavery seem more clearly chosen rather than forced by circumstances. Yet, we can't ignore the urban versus rural divide that cut across all regional boundaries. Urban black slave owners, regardless of state, generally had more economic opportunities, faced different labor demands, and operated within more complex social hierarchies than their rural counterparts. Sound familiar? It's the same urban-rural divide that shapes American society today, except overlaid with the complexities of race and slavery. Of course, urban environments also created unique challenges for black slave owners. Cities had larger free black populations, which meant that enslaved people had more contact with freedom and more opportunities to escape or resist. Meanwhile, urban slavery required different management strategies than plantation agriculture. Let's be clear about the implications of these regional variations. They demonstrate that black slave ownership wasn't a monolithic phenomenon, but rather a complex adaptation to different legal, economic, and social environments. To be fair, this complexity makes moral judgment more difficult but also more necessary, because it shows that choices and circumstances vary dramatically across time and place. By the 1850s, these regional variations had created very different experiences for black slave owners across the South. If you thought the approach of the Civil War would unify these experiences, the reality was that regional differences often mattered more than racial solidarity in determining how black slave owners responded to the crisis. Let's be honest about something that's going to shatter any remaining illusions about moral clarity. When the Civil War finally came, black slave owners found themselves in an impossible position that revealed just how thoroughly the institution of slavery had corrupted American society. That's right. People who shared the racial identity of the enslaved found themselves on both sides of the greatest moral conflict in American history. To be fair, most black slave owners ultimately supported the Union cause, recognizing that their own long-term interests lay with the abolition of slavery. Sound familiar? It's the same calculation that drives people today to support political changes that might cost them economically but benefit them socially or psychologically. Meanwhile, let's talk about William Ellison, whose response to the war perfectly illustrated the moral complexity of the black slave owner position. When South Carolina seceded, Ellison initially supported the Confederacy, apparently believing that his wealth and status would protect him regardless of the outcome. Of course, this calculation proved spectacularly wrong when Union forces occupied his area and his enslaved workers immediately fled to freedom. And yet, Ellison's support for the Confederacy wasn't entirely irrational from his perspective. He had invested decades building his wealth within the existing system, and he may have genuinely believed that gradual change was preferable to the disruption of war. Still, his position put him at odds with the vast majority of Black Americans, both enslaved and free. If you thought the war would immediately resolve the moral dilemmas of Black slave ownership, think again. Many Black slave owners found themselves caught between their economic interests and their racial solidarity, creating psychological conflicts that persisted long after the fighting ended. Meanwhile, their enslaved people often had to choose between loyalty to familiar owners and the promise of freedom with unknown consequences. Let's be clear about what happened when Union forces entered areas with significant Black slave ownership. In most cases, enslaved people immediately abandoned their Black owners just as readily as they fled white ones. That's right. Shared racial identity provided no protection against the fundamental desire for freedom, proving that the master-slave relationship was inherently corrupting regardless of the participant's race. To be fair, some enslaved people owned by Black Americans initially remained with their owners, particularly in cases where the relationship was genuinely familial. Still, even these arrangements often broke down under the pressures of war and the promise of genuine freedom. Sound familiar? It's the same dynamic that drives modern employees to leave even good employers when better opportunities arise. Of course, the collapse of slavery created immediate practical problems for Black slave owners, who had built their entire economic lives around the institution. Unlike white slave owners, who could often rely on family wealth or social connections to weather the transition, Black Americans who lost their enslaved workers often faced complete economic ruin. Meanwhile, the federal government's approach to Black slave owners revealed the legal and moral contradictions of the entire system. Should Black Americans who had owned enslaved people be compensated for their property losses? Should they be held legally accountable for their participation in slavery? That's right. Even the government couldn't figure out how to handle people who were simultaneously oppressors and members of an oppressed group. And yet, the most immediate challenge for former Black slave owners was rebuilding relationships within their own communities. Many free Black Americans who had opposed slavery throughout the antebellum period were unwilling to simply forgive and forget their neighbors' participation in the institution. Still, the practical need for community solidarity in the face of white hostility often overcame these moral objections. Let's talk about the economic aftermath, which was often devastating for Black Americans who had built their wealth on slave labor. Take the Metoyer family of Louisiana, descendants of Marie Therese Coincoin, who lost hundreds of enslaved workers and thousands of acres during the war. If you thought they could simply transition to wage labor like white planters, the reality was far more complicated. To be fair, some former Black slave owners successfully transitioned to new economic models, often employing their former enslaved workers as wage laborers or sharecroppers. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern that characterized the entire post-war South, except Black employers often had even less capital and credit access than white ones. Of course, this transition created new moral complications. Some former Black slave owners became exploitative employers who used debt peonage and other coercive labor practices to maintain control over their former enslaved workers. That's right. The end of slavery didn't automatically end the exploitation. It just changed the legal framework. Meanwhile, we need to acknowledge the psychological trauma experienced by all parties in these relationships. Former enslaved people had to grapple with the betrayal they felt from Black owners, while former owners had to confront the moral weight of their participation in slavery. And yet, Both groups also had to find ways to coexist in post-war communities, where survival often depended on cooperation. Still, the most remarkable aspect of the post-war period was how quickly most black communities moved beyond the divisions created by slave ownership. By the 1870s and 1880s, former black slave owners and former enslaved people were often working together in political organizations, churches, and mutual aid societies. Let's be honest, this reconciliation was probably driven more by practical necessity than moral forgiveness, but it was remarkable nonetheless. And yet, the legacy of black slave ownership persisted in subtle ways throughout the Reconstruction period and beyond. Some former black slave owners used their business experience and capital to become leaders in post-war black communities, while others found themselves marginalized by neighbors who couldn't forget their participation in slavery. Of course, white society's response to former black slave owners was predictably complex. Some whites used the existence of black slave ownership to argue that slavery hadn't been a racial institution, while others viewed former black owners as particularly dangerous because they had proven their ability to accumulate wealth and property. Let's be clear about the legal aftermath. Most former black slave owners lost their enslaved property without compensation, just like white owners. But unlike white owners, they often lacked the political influence and social connections necessary to recover economically in the post-war period. Meanwhile, they faced the additional burden of rebuilding relationships within black communities that had been damaged by their participation in slavery. To be fair, some former black slave owners became important leaders in the fight for civil rights and political equality during Reconstruction. Their business experience and education often made them natural leaders, and their understanding of white society gave them strategic advantages in political negotiations. Sound familiar? It's the same dynamic that often makes former insiders effective reformers. Still, we can't ignore the voices of former enslaved people who remain bitter about their treatment by black owners. Some of these accounts suggest that the sense of betrayal was even greater when the oppressor shared your racial identity, creating wounds that persisted long after emancipation. And yet, by the end of Reconstruction in 1877, most of these divisions had been subsumed under the larger struggle against white supremacy and the rollback of civil rights gains. If you thought the end of slavery would resolve the moral complexities of black slave ownership, the reality was that new forms of racial oppression created new pressures for black solidarity that transcended the old divisions. By the turn of the 20th century, the story of black slave ownership had largely disappeared from public discourse, buried under the weight of Jim Crow segregation and the mythology of the lost cause. Meanwhile, the descendants of both black slave owners and their enslaved workers found themselves united in the face of legal segregation and systematic disenfranchisement that made their ancestors' divisions seem almost quaint by comparison. Let's be clear about why the story of black slave ownership matters in the 21st century. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how oppression actually works, and why simple narratives about good guys and bad guys are usually inadequate for understanding complex historical realities. That's right. If you thought history was going to provide clear moral lessons that map neatly onto contemporary political debates, this story proves otherwise. To be fair, the most important lesson from black slave ownership is how thoroughly corrupt systems can compromise even their victims. Sound familiar? It's the same dynamic we see today when workers in exploitative industries become supervisors who perpetuate the same exploitation, or when members of marginalized groups achieve success by distancing themselves from their communities. Meanwhile, the story challenges our contemporary understanding of intersectionality and identity politics in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. Black slave owners were simultaneously oppressors and members of an oppressed group, proving that identity categories aren't always predictive of political interests or moral behavior. Of course, this doesn't invalidate contemporary movements for racial justice, but it does suggest that human behavior is more complex than our political frameworks often acknowledge. And yet, perhaps the most relevant lesson for modern America is how economic systems can create incentives for behavior that contradicts group solidarity. Black Americans who owned enslaved people weren't necessarily betraying their race. They were often responding rationally to economic opportunities within a corrupt system. That's right, the same logic that drives contemporary debates about gentrification, school choice, and economic mobility. Still, we can't ignore the moral dimensions of these choices. The fact that black slave ownership was economically rational doesn't make it morally acceptable. Just as contemporary examples of individual advancement that harm community interests aren't automatically justified by their personal benefits. Let's be honest, these moral tensions persist in every society and every era. To be fair, the story also illuminates how legal frameworks can create perverse incentives that force people into morally compromised positions. When laws prevented Black Americans from freeing family members they had purchased, the system literally required participation in slavery as an expression of love. Sound familiar? It's the same dynamic we see today when immigration laws force families to make impossible choices about legal status and family unity. Of course, contemporary Americans across the political spectrum have used the story of black slave ownership to support their preferred narratives about race and history. Conservatives point to it as evidence that slavery wasn't inherently racist, while progressives use it to illustrate the complexity of oppression. Meanwhile, both interpretations miss the deeper point about how systems of exploitation actually function. And yet, the story's most important contribution to contemporary debates may be its demonstration that historical victimhood doesn't automatically confer moral authority in all circumstances. Black slave owners were both victims of racial oppression and perpetrators of human exploitation, proving that experience of injustice doesn't necessarily prevent participation in injustice. Let's talk about how this history relates to contemporary discussions of reparations and historical justice. If Black Americans who participated in slavery should be held accountable for their actions, how does that affect arguments about collective racial responsibility for slavery's legacy? Meanwhile, should the descendants of black slave owners be included in reparations programs, or does their ancestors' participation in slavery disqualify them? To be fair, these questions reveal the limitations of group-based approaches to historical justice. The moral complexity of black slave ownership suggests that individual circumstances and choices matter as much as group identity in determining responsibility and deserving. Still, this doesn't necessarily invalidate reparations arguments, but it does complicate them in ways the proponents rarely acknowledge. Sound familiar? It's the same complexity we see in contemporary debates about affirmative action, where individual merit and group identity create competing claims for justice that can't be easily reconciled. Of course, acknowledging complexity doesn't mean abandoning efforts at justice, but it does suggest that simple solutions are usually inadequate. Meanwhile, the story provides important insights into how minority communities navigate oppressive systems. The survival strategies that led some Black Americans to own enslaved people, family protection, economic advancement, social acceptance, are similar to those used by marginalized groups today. And yet, the moral costs of these strategies remain relevant to contemporary discussions about assimilation versus resistance. Let's be honest about the most uncomfortable implication. The story suggests that membership in an oppressed group doesn't automatically create solidarity with other oppressed people. Black slave owners often treated their enslaved workers as harshly as white owners, proving that shared identity isn't always a source of empathy or justice. Still, we need to be careful about how we apply these historical lessons to contemporary situations. The legal and social constraints faced by Black Americans in the antebellum period were far more severe than those faced by any group in modern America. Of course, this doesn't excuse contemporary examples of intragroup exploitation, but it does provide important context for understanding why people make morally compromised choices. And yet, the story's enduring relevance lies in its illustration of how systems of oppression actually function. Slavery wasn't maintained only through violence and legal coercion. It was also maintained through economic incentives that made participation attractive even to some of its victims. That's right. The most effective forms of oppression are those that co-opt their victims rather than simply crushing them. To be fair, this insight has implications for how we understand contemporary forms of inequality and exploitation. When we see members of marginalized groups supporting policies that seem contrary to their group interests, the history of Black slave ownership suggests that individual circumstances and calculations may be more important than group identity in determining political behavior. Of course, none of this absolves anyone of moral responsibility for their choices, historical or contemporary. But it does suggest that moral judgment needs to account for the structural constraints and perverse incentives that shape individual behavior. Meanwhile, efforts at social reform need to address these structural factors rather than simply appealing to group solidarity or moral conscience. Let's be clear about the final lesson. The story of Black slave ownership proves that human behavior is more complex than our political narratives usually acknowledge, and that moral clarity is often a luxury available only to those who haven't faced impossible choices. Sound familiar? It's a reminder that history is messier than we'd like it to be, and that understanding complexity is more important than maintaining comfortable narratives about good and evil. Let's be honest about something that makes economists and historians equally uncomfortable. Black slave ownership was, in many cases, a perfectly rational economic decision that happened to be morally abhorrent. That's right. If you thought moral clarity and economic logic always aligned, the antebellum economy is here to shatter that illusion faster than a cotton gin separates seeds from fiber. To be fair, understanding the economics of Black slave ownership requires us to think like accountants in a moral wasteland. Sound familiar? It's the same cold calculation that drives modern businesses to outsource labor to countries with questionable human rights records. Profit margins don't care about conscience. Meanwhile, let's talk numbers that will make your head spin. William Ellison's 63 enslaved people weren't just human beings. They were assets worth approximately $45,000 in 1860 money, equivalent to over $1.5 million today. Of course, this human capital generated annual returns through cotton production that far exceeded what Ellison could have earned through any other investment available to Black Americans. And yet, the economic logic of slave ownership created a vicious cycle that trapped even well-meaning Black Americans. Once you owned enslaved people, your economic survival depended on their continued productivity. If you thought compassion and profitability could coexist, think again. Market pressures often forced even the most benevolent owners to make harsh decisions. Still, we need to understand how credit markets worked in the antebellum South to grasp why some Black Americans felt compelled to own enslaved people. Banks rarely extended credit to free Black Americans for business ventures, but they would lend money against enslaved people as collateral. That's right. Human beings served as both labor and loan guarantees in the twisted financial system of the time. Let's be clear about the insurance implications that most people never consider. Enslaved people could be insured against death, injury, or escape. making them more secure investments than land or equipment. Marie-Therese Coinsoin's business empire was built partly on this financial reality. Enslaved workers were literally walking insurance policies that generated income while protecting capital. Of course, the rental market for enslaved labor created additional economic incentives for black ownership. In cities like Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans, skilled enslaved workers could be rented out for daily or weekly wages that often exceeded the cost of their upkeep. Meanwhile, this system allowed even small-scale black owners to generate steady income from their human property. To be fair, the economics of urban slavery were fundamentally different from plantation agriculture. A skilled carpenter or blacksmith who was enslaved could generate $300 to $500 annually for their owner, while costing perhaps $100 to $150 in food, clothing, and housing. Sound familiar? It's the same markup principle that drives modern service industries, except the employees were legally property. And yet, these economic calculations created genuine moral hazards for black slave owners. The more profitable their enslaved workers became, the harder it was to justify freeing them, even when freedom was legally possible. If you thought love would always triumph over money, the historical record suggests that economic pressure could corrupt even the most loving relationships. Meanwhile, let's talk about the agricultural economics that drove plantation-scale black slave ownership. Cotton prices in the 1850s made large-scale production incredibly profitable, but only with enslaved labor. Free wage labor was either unavailable or unaffordable for most agricultural ventures, creating a system where economic success virtually required human ownership. Still, we need to acknowledge the unique challenges faced by black agricultural entrepreneurs. White suppliers often charged them higher prices for equipment and supplies, while buyers frequently paid them less for their crops. Of course, these discriminatory practices meant that black planters needed even higher profit margins to succeed, which often translated into harsher treatment of enslaved workers. Let's be honest about the estate planning implications that trapped many black families in slave ownership. When successful black Americans died, their enslaved people often became part of complex inheritance arrangements that made immediate freedom impossible. That's right. Even death couldn't resolve the moral contradictions of the system. It just passed them on to the next generation. To be fair, some black slave owners tried to create economic arrangements that benefited their enslaved workers while maintaining legal ownership. Profit-sharing agreements, skill development programs, and eventual freedom contracts were more common among black owners than white ones. Meanwhile, these arrangements often collapsed under legal pressure or economic stress. Of course, the banking relationships available to black slave owners reveal another layer of economic complexity. Most black Americans, regardless of wealth, couldn't access the same credit markets as white entrepreneurs. This financial isolation meant that enslaved people often served as the primary form of liquid capital available for business expansion or emergency needs. And yet, the investment returns on enslaved people varied dramatically based on age, skills, and health. A young, skilled male worker might appreciate in value over time, while older or less skilled individuals often depreciated. Sound familiar? It's the same actuarial thinking that drives modern insurance and investment markets, except applied to human beings. Meanwhile, let's examine the regional variations in slave economics that shape black ownership patterns. In Louisiana's sugar parishes, the intensive labor requirements and high profit margins made enslaved workers extremely valuable investments. Still, the dangerous working conditions and high mortality rates meant that slave ownership was also a high-risk proposition. If you thought the economics of slavery were straightforward, consider the seasonal variations that affected profitability. Cotton harvests, rice cultivation, and sugar processing all had peak labor periods that determined annual profits. Black slave owners had to calculate not just annual costs and revenues, but seasonal cash flows that could make or break their enterprises. Let's talk about the hidden costs of slave ownership that many black entrepreneurs underestimated. Medical care, clothing, housing maintenance, and food costs could easily consume 30 to 40% of the income generated by enslaved workers. Of course, these costs were often higher for black owners who provided better living conditions than their white counterparts. Still, the tax implications of slave ownership created additional economic pressures. Enslaved people were taxed as property in most states, and these taxes often represented significant annual expenses for black owners. Meanwhile, the tax assessments were usually based on market values that could fluctuate dramatically based on political events or economic conditions. And yet, we can't ignore the role of enslaved people themselves in these economic calculations. Skilled workers who understood their value often negotiated informal agreements with black owners that resembled employment contracts more than master-slave relationships. That's right. The economics of slavery sometimes created quasi-free labor arrangements that challenged the legal framework. To be fair, these arrangements were always precarious and depended on the goodwill of owners who could revoke them at any time. Sound familiar? It's the same insecurity that characterizes modern gig economy work, except with the added horror of legal bondage. Of course, the economic success of black slave owners often created resentment among white competitors who couldn't understand how inferior people could outperform them in business. This economic jealousy frequently translated into legal restrictions and social pressure designed to limit black entrepreneurship. Meanwhile, the wealth accumulated by successful black slave owners sometimes lasted for generations, creating family dynasties that persisted long after emancipation. The Metoyer family of Louisiana, descendants of Marie-Thérèse Coincoin, maintained their wealth and influence well into the 20th century, proving that slave-generated capital could have lasting effects. Let's be clear about the opportunity costs that black Americans faced when choosing whether to own enslaved people. The capital required to purchase workers could have been invested in other ventures, but alternative investment opportunities were often unavailable to black entrepreneurs. Still, this doesn't excuse the moral choice to profit from human bondage. And yet, the economic data suggests that black slave owners generally achieved higher returns on their investments than white owners, possibly because they understood their workers' capabilities better or managed them more efficiently. If you thought this efficiency came from compassion, think again. It probably came from shared cultural understanding and more effective incentive systems by the 1850s. The economics of black slave ownership had created a small but significant class of wealthy black Americans whose interests were genuinely aligned with the preservation of slavery. To be fair, this alignment was often reluctant and conflicted, but it was real nonetheless. Meanwhile, their economic success provided ammunition for pro-slavery arguments about the benefits of the institution for all races. Let's be honest about something that's going to complicate every assumption you have about gender and slavery. Black women were some of the most successful and ruthless slave owners in American history, proving that oppression doesn't automatically create solidarity across gender lines any more than it does across racial ones. That's right. If you thought sisterhood would trump the economics of human ownership, prepare to have your feminist assumptions thoroughly challenged. To be fair, black women faced unique challenges in achieving slave ownership that make their success even more remarkable and morally complex. In a legal system that denied married women property rights and restricted single women's economic activities, black women who managed to own enslaved people had to navigate both racial and gender discrimination simultaneously. Sound familiar? It's the same intersectional oppression that scholars write about today, except these women found ways to profit from the very system that marginalized them. Meanwhile, let's talk about Marie-Thérèse Coin, whose story reads like a master class in strategic relationship management. Born into slavery around 1742, she became the concubine of French merchant Claude Thomas Pierre Médor and bore him 10 children. Of course, when Médor decided to return to France, he freed Marie-Thérèse and their children, giving her land. Along Louisiana's Cane River, what Marie-Thérèse did next was extraordinary. She built a business empire that eventually included multiple plantations and nearly 100 enslaved workers. That's right, a woman who had been born into slavery became one of the largest slave owners in Louisiana, male or female, black or white. And yet, her success came at the cost of enslaving people who shared her racial background and often her personal experiences of bondage. Still, we need to understand Marie-Thérèse's strategy within the context of her limited options. As a free woman of color in colonial Louisiana, she couldn't vote, couldn't testify against white people in court, and faced constant threats to her freedom and that of her children. Meanwhile, accumulating enslaved workers provided both economic security and social protection in a society that measured worth in property ownership. Let's be clear about how gender shaped the motivations of black women slave owners differently from their male counterparts. Women were more likely to purchase family members, particularly children and elderly relatives, as a form of protection rather than economic exploitation. Of course, this doesn't make their participation in slavery morally acceptable, but it does reveal how gender roles influence the experience of slave ownership. And yet, some black women operated purely as business entrepreneurs who treated enslaved people as investments rather than family. Take the case of free women of color in New Orleans who inherited enslaved people from white fathers or lovers and built those inheritances into substantial enterprises. If you thought maternal instincts would prevent such exploitation, the historical record proves otherwise. To be fair, black women slave owners often faced unique psychological pressures that their male counterparts didn't experience. As mothers themselves, they had to reconcile their love for their own children with their ownership of other women's children. Sound familiar? It's the same cognitive dissonance that allows modern parents to buy products made with child labor while protecting their own families. Meanwhile, let's examine the specific case of Eulie de Mandeville McCarty in New Orleans, who inherited substantial property, including enslaved people, and used her wealth to become one of the most influential women in the city's free-colored community. Her salon hosted politicians, artists, and intellectuals, proving that black women could achieve social influence even within a racist and sexist society. Of course, McCarty's influence depended partly on her ability to demonstrate that she could manage enslaved people as effectively as any white woman. This performance of competent ownership required her to maintain the same harsh discipline and economic calculations that characterized white female slave ownership. That's right. Gender solidarity was no match for racial hierarchy when economic interests were at stake. Still, we need to acknowledge that black women slave owners were often protecting more than just their immediate families. In a society where free black women faced constant threats of sexual violence and re-enslavement, owning property, including human property, provided a form of legal and social armor that was otherwise unavailable. And yet, this protection came at enormous psychological costs. Contemporary accounts describe black women slave owners struggling with depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress symptoms. The cognitive dissonance required to own people who reminded them of their own vulnerability was often psychologically devastating. Let's talk about the unique ways that Black women slave owners managed their human property. Female owners were more likely to assign domestic work rather than field labor, more likely to allow family relationships among their enslaved people, and more likely to provide basic education and skill training. Meanwhile, these management practices were often more humane than those of male owners, but they were still fundamentally exploitative. To be fair, some black women developed innovative approaches to slave management that blurred the lines between ownership and employment. Profit-sharing arrangements, eventual freedom contracts, and quasi-adoption of enslaved children were more common among female owners. Sound familiar? It's the same maternal capitalism that drives modern family businesses, except within the legal framework of human bondage. Of course, we can't ignore the cases where black women slave owners were particularly cruel or exploitative. Some inherited their attitudes toward enslaved people from the white families that had freed them, adopting the same paternalistic racism that characterized white female slave ownership. That's right, proximity to whiteness sometimes corrupted black women just as thoroughly as it corrupted black men. Meanwhile, the marriage patterns of black women slave owners reveal another layer of complexity. Women who married free black men sometimes had to negotiate complex property arrangements that included enslaved people. If both spouses owned enslaved workers, marriage could create households with dozens of human beings as property. And yet, these marriages also created opportunities for more humane treatment of enslaved people. Couples who both understood the experience of oppression sometimes developed management strategies that prioritized family preservation and skill development over pure profit maximization. Still, even the most benevolent arrangements couldn't escape the fundamental moral corruption of human ownership. Let's be honest about the reproductive implications of black women owning enslaved people. Female slave owners had to make decisions about the children born to their enslaved workers, including whether to sell them, free them, or keep them as property. These decisions often reflected the owner's own experiences of family separation and sexual exploitation. Some black women slave owners created informal adoption arrangements with enslaved children, blurring the lines between family and property in ways that were psychologically complex for everyone involved. Meanwhile, these arrangements often broke down when economic pressures or legal requirements forced owners to treat family members as property. To be fair, black women who inherited enslaved people from white fathers or lovers faced particular challenges in managing these relationships. The enslaved people often included their own half-siblings or other relatives, creating family dynamics that were simultaneously intimate and exploitative. Sound familiar? It's the same complexity that characterizes modern blended families, except with legal ownership overlaying kinship bonds. Of course, the educational backgrounds of black women slave owners often influenced their management approaches. Women who had received education from white families or religious institutions sometimes applied those lessons to the treatment of their enslaved people, creating schools, providing literacy training, and emphasizing moral instruction. Still, even these educational efforts were paternalistic and served the owner's interests as much as the enslaved people's needs. Educated enslaved workers were more valuable and more manageable, making education an investment strategy rather than purely altruistic behavior. And yet the long-term benefits for enslaved people were real, even if the motivations were mixed. Let's talk about the networks of mutual support that developed among black women slave owners. In cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Richmond, successful free women of color created informal business associations that shared information about slave management, investment strategies, and legal protection. Meanwhile, these networks also reinforced the social acceptability of slave ownership within free black communities. And yet, These same networks sometimes became sources of moral pressure for more humane treatment of enslaved people. Women who were known for particularly harsh management faced social ostracism from other free black women, creating informal accountability mechanisms that didn't exist in white society. By the 1850s, black women slave owners had developed distinctive patterns of human property management that reflected their unique position as multiply marginalized people who had achieved economic success. If you thought gender would automatically make them more compassionate owners, the evidence suggests that survival instincts and economic pressures often trumped sisterly solidarity. Let's be clear about something that's going to break your heart and challenge your assumptions simultaneously. Children born to black slave owners grew up in households where their playmates were literally their property, creating psychological dynamics so twisted that modern child psychologists would need new diagnostic categories. That's right. If you thought childhood innocence could survive the institution of slavery, prepare to learn about kids who learn to own people before they learn to tie their shoes. To be fair, these children faced moral contradictions that would challenge adults, let alone young minds trying to understand their place in the world. Sound familiar? It's like raising kids in a war zone and expecting them to develop normal moral intuitions about violence and power relationships. Meanwhile, let's talk about the Ellison children of South Carolina, who grew up on their father William's plantation, surrounded by dozens of enslaved people their own age. Contemporary accounts describe these children playing together during the day and then separating at night when the enslaved children returned to their quarters. Of course, as they grew older, the Ellison children had to learn to exercise authority over their former playmates, a transition that was psychologically devastating for everyone involved. And yet, some children of black slave owners developed genuine friendships with enslaved people that persisted into adulthood, creating relationships that were simultaneously caring and exploitative. If you thought childhood bonds would prevent the exercise of ownership, think again. Many of these relationships simply became more complex rather than more equal over time. Still, we need to understand how black parents who owned enslaved people tried to explain the system to their children. Some emphasized the protective aspects of ownership, teaching their children that they were keeping enslaved people safe from worse treatment by white owners. Meanwhile, others adopted the full racial hierarchy of white society, teaching their children that enslaved people were naturally inferior and deserved their fate. Let's be honest about the educational implications of growing up in black slave-owning households. Children who were taught that some people were property inevitably developed different moral intuitions than those raised in non-slave-owning families. That's right, the institution of slavery corrupted moral development, even within families that were themselves victims of racial oppression. To be fair, some black slave-owning parents tried to limit their children's exposure to the harsher aspects of slave management. They might assign disciplinary responsibilities to overseers or avoid discussing slave sales and punishments in front of their children. Sound familiar? It's the same protective instinct that drives modern parents to shield their kids from adult realities. Except the reality being hidden was their family's participation in human bondage. Of course, these protective efforts often failed because children are naturally observant and curious about power relationships. Young people growing up in slave-owning households quickly learn to distinguish between different types of authority and to understand their own position in the racial and economic hierarchy. Meanwhile, let's examine the specific case of the Métard children in Louisiana, descendants of Marie-Thérèse Coin, who inherited substantial plantations and hundreds of enslaved people. These children grew up thinking of themselves as a kind of black aristocracy, complete with the sense of entitlement and racial superiority that typically characterized white planter families. And yet, the Métard children also faced the constant Reminder that their elevated status was precarious and dependent on white approval. Laws restricting free people of color meant that their wealth and property could be threatened at any time, creating a psychological tension between privilege and vulnerability that shaped their entire worldview. Still, we can't ignore the accounts of children from black slave-owning families who rebelled against their parents' participation in slavery. Some refused to inherit enslaved people, others freed inherited workers despite economic costs, and still others left the South, entirely to escape the moral compromises of their upbringing. Let's talk about the gender differences in how children of black slave owners learned to navigate the system. Boys were typically groomed to take over business operations and property management, which meant learning to exercise direct authority over enslaved people. Meanwhile, girls were often taught more indirect forms of control that emphasized domestic management and social relationships. To be fair, these gender differences sometimes created more humane outcomes for enslaved people, as women were often socialized to prioritize family preservation and community harmony. Sound familiar? It's the same gender division of emotional labor that characterizes modern families, except applied to the management of human property. Of course, children of black slave owners also had to learn to navigate the broader racial hierarchy of antebellum society. They needed to understand when to defer to white authority while maintaining control over enslaved people, a complex social calculation that required sophisticated understanding of multiple power relationships. And yet, perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of growing up in these households was the way it normalized human ownership as a family value. Children learned that love and ownership could coexist, that protection could justify bondage, and that economic success required moral compromise. Meanwhile, let's examine how education functioned in black slave-owning families. Wealthy black parents often provided their children with excellent educations, sometimes sending them to schools in the North or even Europe. Still, this education had to be reconciled with the reality of their family's wealth being built on enslaved labor. If you thought education would automatically create moral enlightenment, the experiences of these families prove otherwise. Some of the most educated children of black slave owners became the most effective managers of human property, using their knowledge to maximize profits and maintain control more efficiently than their less educated peers. Let's be clear about the religious instruction that these children received. Many black slave-owning families were deeply religious and tried to reconcile their faith with their participation in slavery. Children learned theological justifications for human bondage that paralleled those taught in white households, proving that religious education could be used to support any social system. Still, some children from these families experienced genuine religious conversions that led them to reject slavery entirely. The tension between Christian teachings about human equality and the reality of human ownership created spiritual crises for some young people that persisted throughout their lives. To be fair, we need to acknowledge that children born into black slave-owning families didn't choose their circumstances any more than children born into enslaved families chose theirs. Both groups were victims of a system that corrupted normal human relationships and moral development. And yet, the children of black slave owners had choices available to them that enslaved children didn't, and their use of those choices carries moral weight. Some chose to perpetuate the system that had benefited their families, while others chose to reject it despite personal costs. Of course, the psychological legacy of growing up in these households persisted long after emancipation. Adult children of black slave owners often struggled with guilt, shame, and identity conflicts that affected their relationships with other black Americans for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the descendants of black slave-owning families sometimes maintained class distinctions and social attitudes that reflected their ancestors' participation in slavery. If you thought the Civil War would erase these internal hierarchies within black communities, the persistence of colorism and classism proves otherwise. Let's talk about the inheritance patterns that shape these children's futures. Some inherited enslaved people as teenagers and had to decide immediately whether to maintain ownership or seek freedom for their human property. Meanwhile, others inherited debt-encumbered estates where enslaved people served as collateral for family obligations. By the time of the Civil War, the children and grandchildren of black slave owners represented a unique generation of Americans who had been raised within slavery but were also its victims. Their responses to emancipation varied dramatically, but their experiences provide crucial insights into how systems of oppression shape moral development across generations. Let's be honest about something that's going to make every social justice warrior and conservative pundit equally uncomfortable. The transformation from oppressed to oppressor doesn't require a change in character. It just requires a change in circumstances and opportunity. That's right. If you thought there was something inherently different about people who owned enslaved workers versus those who were enslaved, the story of black slave ownership proves that the capacity for both cruelty and kindness exists within all human beings. To be fair, understanding the psychology of black slave owners requires us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about how power actually works in human societies. Sound familiar? It's the same dynamic we see today when members of marginalized groups achieve positions of authority and sometimes become as oppressive as their former oppressors. Meanwhile, let's talk about the psychological defense mechanisms that black slave owners developed to justify their participation in an institution they knew was fundamentally wrong. Cognitive dissonance theory suggests that people resolve conflicting beliefs by changing either their behavior or their attitudes, and most black slave owners chose to modify their attitudes rather than abandon profitable behavior. Of course, this psychological adaptation often involved adopting the same racial hierarchies and paternalistic justifications that white slave owners used. Some black slave owners convinced themselves that enslaved people were naturally inferior, that slavery was divinely ordained, or that they were providing protection rather than exploitation. That's right, oppression creates its own ideology, and even victims can become believers. And yet, the psychological pressure of owning people who shared your racial identity created unique forms of mental stress that white slave owners didn't experience. Black slave owners had to constantly navigate the contradiction between their own experiences of racial oppression and their participation in that same oppression of others. Still, we need to understand how the psychology of survival influenced these moral calculations. For many black Americans, slave ownership wasn't primarily about wealth accumulation. It was about creating a buffer zone of security in a hostile society. Meanwhile, this survival mentality could justify almost any behavior as necessary for family protection. Let's be clear about the role of trauma in shaping black slave owners' psychology. Many had experienced the horrors of slavery themselves, or had family members who were enslaved. This trauma sometimes created a desperate need for control and security that could only be satisfied by owning others. If you thought trauma would automatically create empathy, think again. It often creates the opposite. To be fair, trauma responses vary dramatically among individuals and can include both increased compassion and increased cruelty. Some black slave owners who had been brutally treated became gentle masters, while others repeated the patterns of abuse they had experienced. Sound familiar? It's the same cycle of trauma that characterizes domestic violence and child abuse across all communities. Of course, the psychology of assimilation played a crucial role in how black slave owners understood their place in society. Owning enslaved people was often a way of performing whiteness, of demonstrating commitment to the existing social order, and of gaining acceptance from white society. Meanwhile, His performance sometimes became so convincing that the performers began to believe their own act. And yet, the psychological costs of this performance were enormous. Black slave owners had to maintain multiple identities, simultaneously oppressed. Person and oppressor, victim and victimizer, insider and outsider. The mental energy required to navigate these contradictions often led to anxiety, depression, and what we would now recognize as identity disorders. Let's talk about the specific psychological mechanisms that allowed black slave owners to maintain authority over people who looked like them. Social psychology research shows that people can justify almost any behavior by emphasizing small differences rather than obvious similarities. Black slave owners often focused on education, skill level, legal status, or family background to create psychological distance from their enslaved workers. Meanwhile, the development of in-group and out-group psychology allowed some black slave owners to see themselves as fundamentally different from enslaved people, despite shared racial identity. This psychological separation was often based on class, color, culture, or religion rather than race, proving that human beings are remarkably creative in constructing hierarchies that justify their behavior. Still, we can't ignore the evidence that many black slave owners struggled constantly with guilt and moral conflict about their participation in slavery. Personal letters, diary entries, and contemporary accounts describe internal battles between conscience and circumstance that sometimes led to mental breakdowns or complete withdrawal from slave management. Thought to be fair, some black slave owners developed elaborate psychological justifications that allowed them to see themselves as protectors rather than exploiters. These rescue narratives emphasized the dangers that enslaved people faced from white society and portrayed black ownership as a form of sanctuary. Sound familiar? It's the same logic that modern abusers use to justify controlling behavior as protection. Of course, the psychology of power itself changed people in ways they didn't expect or intend. Research on authority and obedience shows that people who exercise power over others often become more callous, more entitled, and less empathetic over time. Black slave owners weren't immune to these psychological effects, simply because they shared racial identity with their victims. And yet, the unique position of black slave owners, powerful within the slave system, but powerless within the broader racial hierarchy, created psychological pressures that were probably unprecedented in human history. They had to maintain authority while accepting subordination, exercise power while acknowledging powerlessness. Let's be honest about the role of social proof in shaping black slave owners' psychology. When they saw other successful black Americans owning enslaved people, it normalized the behavior and reduced psychological resistance to participation. Meanwhile, the absence of widespread condemnation within free black communities provided social permission for morally questionable choices. Still, the psychology of moral injury, the damage caused by perpetrating acts that violate one's moral beliefs, affected many black slave owners throughout their lives. Veterans' experiences with PTSD provide modern parallels for understanding how participation in systemic violence can create lasting psychological damage for perpetrators as well as victims. To be fair, we need to acknowledge that some black slave owners seemed genuinely psychologically unaffected by their participation in slavery. These individuals had either fully internalized the racial hierarchies of their society or had developed such effective psychological defenses that they felt no moral conflict about human ownership. Of course, the children and grandchildren of black slave owners often inherited not just property, but also the psychological frameworks that justified that property. Generational trauma works in multiple directions, and the psychological adaptations required for slave ownership were often passed down through families along with material wealth. Meanwhile, Let's examine how the psychology of scarcity influenced black slave ownership decisions. People who have experienced extreme poverty or insecurity often develop hoarding behaviors and difficulty sharing resources, even when sharing would be morally appropriate. For Black Americans who had escaped slavery, the fear of returning to powerlessness could justify almost any action that provided security. And yet, the most psychologically damaging aspect of black slave ownership may have been its impact on community relationships. Owning enslaved people created barriers between black slave owners and other Black Americans that persisted long after emancipation, fragmenting communities that needed solidarity for survival. If you thought the psychology of black slave ownership was simply individual pathology, think again. It reveals fundamental truths about how oppressive systems corrupt everyone they touch, turning victims into victimizers and creating cycles of trauma that persist across generations. Meanwhile, understanding these psychological dynamics is crucial for preventing similar patterns in contemporary society. By the 1850s, the psychological adaptations required for black slave ownership had created a distinctive mindset that combined racial consciousness with class consciousness, victim identity with oppressor behavior, and moral awareness with practical compromise. Let's be clear. This psychological complexity doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does help us understand how good people can make terrible choices when operating within corrupt systems. By the 1850s, the psychological adaptations required for black slave ownership had created a distinctive mindset that combined racial consciousness with class consciousness, victim identity with oppressor behavior, and moral awareness with practical compromise. Let's be clear. This psychological complexity doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does help us understand how good people can make terrible choices when operating within corrupt systems. Let's be honest about something that's going to make your head spin faster than a lawyer's billing meter. The legal framework surrounding black slave ownership was so convoluted and contradictory that it could drive sane people to madness, and often did exactly that. That's right. If you thought modern tax law was complicated, try being a Black American in 1840, trying to legally own another human being while simultaneously being denied basic legal rights yourself. To be fair, understanding how Black Americans could legally own enslaved people requires us to dive into a legal system that was designed by white men, for white men, with Black Americans as an afterthought, or more accurately, as a problem to be managed. Sound familiar? It's the same institutional bias that characterizes many legal systems today, except with the added horror of human chattel slavery as the underlying economic foundation. Meanwhile, let's talk about the fundamental legal contradiction that created space for black slave ownership in the first place. Most slave states defined enslaved people as property, while simultaneously granting free Black Americans limited property rights. Of course, this created a logical paradox. If black people could own property and enslaved people were property, then mathematically black people could own other black people. And yet, the legal framework that allowed this ownership was constantly shifting and becoming more restrictive as the antebellum period progressed. What was legal for Black Americans in 1800 might be illegal by 1850, creating a constantly moving legal target that required extraordinary skill and luck to navigate successfully. Still, we need to understand the specific legal mechanisms that made black slave ownership possible. In most states, free Black Americans could purchase enslaved people through the same legal channels available to white buyers' slave markets: estate sales, private negotiations, and inheritance. That's right. The law treated human beings as fungible commodities that could be bought and sold like livestock or furniture. Let's be clear about the documentation requirements that black slave owners had to meet. Every enslaved person had to have proper legal title, often including bills of sale, previous ownership records, and sometimes court documents proving the legitimacy of the transaction. If you thought paperwork was tedious today, imagine having to maintain legal documentation proving you owned another human being. To be fair, these documentation requirements were often more strictly enforced for black owners than white ones. Courts and law enforcement officials were naturally suspicious of black Americans who claimed to own valuable property, leading to frequent legal challenges and harassment that white owners rarely faced. Of course, the legal status of enslaved people owned by black Americans was identical to those owned by whites in most jurisdictions. They could be bought, sold, inherited, used as collateral for loans, and subjected to all the legal instruments that applied to other forms of property. Meanwhile, this legal equivalence meant that black owners had the same legal rights and responsibilities as white owners, including the obligation to maintain control and discipline. And yet, the legal protections available to black slave owners were often theoretical rather than practical. When disputes arose between black and white Americans over enslaved people, courts typically favored white litigants regardless of the legal merits of the case. Sound familiar? It's the same systemic bias that characterizes many legal systems. Today, when dealing with marginalized populations, let's talk about the specific case of manumission laws, which created some of the most twisted legal scenarios in American history. By the 1840s and 1850s, most southern states had severely restricted or completely banned the freeing of enslaved people. This meant that black Americans who purchased family members to protect them often couldn't legally free them even if they wanted to. Meanwhile, these manumission restrictions created the perverse legal situation where love required ownership and protection demanded bondage. Black Americans who bought their spouses, children, or parents were legally required to maintain them as property, even when the emotional relationship was one of equality or even deference. Still, some black slave owners found creative legal workarounds to these restrictions. Quasi-adoption arrangements were provisions that took effect after death, and relocation to states with more liberal manumission laws were all strategies used to circumvent restrictive legislation. Of course, these workarounds were often challenged in court and sometimes reversed years after they were implemented. To be fair, the legal complexity of black slave ownership extended beyond simple purchase and sale transactions. Estate planning for black Americans who owned enslaved people required navigating inheritance laws, tax obligations, and creditor claims that could affect multiple generations. Sound familiar? It's the same complexity that characterizes modern wealth transfer, except the assets included human beings. And yet, let's examine the legal challenges that arose when black slave owners died without clear wills or estate plans. Enslaved people could become entangled in probate proceedings that lasted for years, during which their legal status remained uncertain and their living conditions often deteriorated. Meanwhile, family members who had been owned for protection might find themselves sold to strangers to satisfy estate debts. Of course, the legal system's treatment of crimes involving black slave owners reveals another layer of complexity. When enslaved people owned by black Americans committed crimes, the legal proceedings often differed from those involving white-owned slaves. Some courts were more lenient, others more harsh, but all were inconsistent in ways that reflected broader racial biases. Let's be honest about the contract law implications of black slave ownership. When black Americans hired out their enslaved workers, the legal agreements were often more complex than similar arrangements involving white owners. Insurance requirements, liability questions, and dispute resolution mechanisms all had to account for the owner's precarious legal status. Meanwhile, the banking and credit laws that applied to black slave owners were often discriminatory in ways that made business operations extremely difficult. While enslaved people could serve as collateral for loans, Black Americans often faced higher interest rates, shorter repayment terms, and more restrictive covenants than white borrowers with similar assets. Still, we need to acknowledge that some black slave owners became remarkably sophisticated legal practitioners out of necessity. Managing enslaved people while navigating discriminatory laws required skills that many lawyers would envy. William Ellison of South Carolina, for example, successfully litigated multiple cases involving property disputes, contract violations, and inheritance claims. To be fair, this legal sophistication sometimes created resentment among white Americans who couldn't understand how inferior people could outmaneuver them in legal proceedings. Such resentment often led to changes in laws that were specifically designed to limit black legal capabilities. And yet, the most morally complex legal scenarios arose when black slave owners were forced to participate in the enforcement of slave codes. Free black Americans who owned enslaved people were sometimes required to assist in capturing runaway slaves, even when those fugitives were fleeing from white owners. If you thought racial solidarity would prevent such cooperation, the legal pressure and potential penalties often proved stronger than ethnic loyalty. Of course, the legal framework also created situations where black slave owners had to testify against enslaved people in criminal proceedings. Since enslaved people couldn't testify against white Americans in most jurisdictions, black owners sometimes became crucial witnesses in cases involving their own workers or other enslaved people. Let's talk about the interstate legal complications that arose when black slave owners traveled or relocated with their human property. Different states had different laws governing the movement of enslaved people, and some specifically prohibited free black Americans from bringing enslaved workers across state lines. Meanwhile, these restrictions could trap families in particular locations or force them to abandon valuable property. Still, some black slave owners found ways to exploit interstate legal differences to their advantage, moving enslaved people to states with more liberal manumission laws, establishing business operations across state lines, and using jurisdictional differences to avoid restrictive regulations were all strategies employed by sophisticated operators. And yet, perhaps the most revealing aspect of the legal framework was how it evolved in response to black success. As more black Americans achieved wealth and property ownership, laws became increasingly restrictive in ways that were clearly designed to limit their advancement. That's right, the legal system adapted specifically to prevent black Americans from using the same strategies that had made white Americans wealthy. By the 1850s, the legal labyrinth surrounding black slave ownership had become so complex that even successful black entrepreneurs often hired white lawyers to navigate the system. Meanwhile, this dependence on white legal assistance created additional vulnerabilities and expenses that white slave owners didn't face. Let's be clear about the ultimate legal irony. The same legal system that allowed black Americans to own enslaved people was simultaneously working to re-enslave the owners themselves. Free black Americans lived under constant legal threat, and their property ownership, including human property, often made them more visible targets for legal harassment rather than providing protection. Let's be honest about something that's going to make both believers and atheists equally uncomfortable. Some of the most devoutly religious black Americans in antebellum society were also slave owners who found elaborate theological justifications for human bondage that would make medieval scholastics proud. That's right. If you thought faith would automatically prevent participation in slavery, prepare to learn about people who prayed over their account books while calculating the market value of human souls. To be fair, understanding how deeply religious black Americans reconciled their faith with slave ownership requires us to grapple with the incredible flexibility of religious interpretation when economic interests are at stake. Sound familiar? It's the same theological gymnastics that allows modern believers to justify almost any behavior by finding the right biblical passage or religious authority. Meanwhile, let's talk about the specific religious frameworks that black slave owners used to make sense of their participation in human bondage. Many adopted the same curse of Ham interpretation that white Christians used, arguing that black people were divinely ordained to serve others. Of course, this required them to create complex hierarchies within blackness that placed themselves above other black Americans in God's plan. And yet, some black slave owners developed more sophisticated theological arguments that emphasized their role as Christian protectors of enslaved people who might otherwise fall under the influence of godless white masters. These missionary justifications portrayed slave ownership as a form of religious stewardship that served God's purposes even while violating apparent moral principles. Still, we need to understand that most black slave owners attended the same churches as other free black Americans and enslaved people, creating weekly reminders of the moral contradictions in their lives. Sitting in pews alongside people who shared their racial identity while owning others who looked exactly like them required extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. Let's be clear about the specific case of Reverend John Chavis of North Carolina, a Presbyterian minister who owned several enslaved people while preaching about Christian equality and divine justice. Chavis somehow managed to reconcile his theological training with human ownership by emphasizing gradual improvement and moral education rather than immediate liberation. If you thought religious education would prevent such contradictions, his career proves otherwise. To be fair, Chavis wasn't unusual among black religious leaders who owned enslaved people. Ministers, church officials, and devout lay people were represented among black slave owners at rates similar to the general free black population. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern we see today when religious leaders are caught in financial scandals or moral hypocrisies that contradict their public teachings. Of course, the religious communities that black slave owners belonged to often struggled with how to address the moral implications of human ownership within their congregations. Some churches developed elaborate codes of conduct that regulated the treatment of enslaved people without challenging the institution itself, while others simply avoided the topic entirely. Meanwhile, let's examine how black slave owners used religious instruction as a tool of control over their enslaved workers. Many required attendance at religious services, provided biblical education, and emphasized Christian virtues like obedience and patience. And yet, these same religious teachings could also provide enslaved people with intellectual tools for resistance and liberation. Still, the religious education provided by black slave owners was often more comprehensive and less manipulative than that offered by white owners. Black Americans who had experienced oppression themselves were sometimes more likely to teach the full gospel message rather than just the parts about submission and obedience. And yet, we can't ignore the accounts of enslaved people who described their black owners as being particularly hypocritical about religious matters. Some reported that black masters were more likely to quote scripture while administering punishment or to use religious language to justify harsh treatment. That's right. Shared faith sometimes made the experience of enslavement more psychologically painful rather than more bearable. Let's talk about the prayer life of black slave owners, which contemporary accounts suggest was often tormented by guilt and moral conflict. Personal letters and diary entries reveal people who prayed for forgiveness while continuing to profit from human bondage, who asked God to bless their businesses while knowing those businesses were built on sin. To be fair, some black slave owners experienced genuine religious conversions that led them to free their enslaved people, despite significant economic costs. These spiritual awakenings often came during revival meetings or personal crises, that forced confrontation with the moral implications of human ownership. Meanwhile, the theological debates within black churches about slavery reveal the intellectual sophistication of antebellum black religious thought. Ministers and theologians developed complex arguments about divine providence, human agency, and moral responsibility that rivaled anything produced by white seminaries. Of course, these theological discussions often had practical implications for how black slave owners treated their enslaved workers. Churches that emphasized immediate moral accountability were more likely to produce owners who provided better living conditions and more opportunities for advancement. And yet, the most psychologically damaging aspect of religious participation for black slave owners may have been the weekly reminder of their moral compromises. Hearing sermons about justice, mercy, and human dignity while owning other human beings created cognitive dissonance that some people never resolved. Let's be honest about the role of biblical interpretation in justifying black slave ownership. The same scriptures that were used to support white supremacy could be interpreted to support black ownership of other black people, proving that religious texts are infinitely malleable when people need theological cover for economic decisions. Still, we need to acknowledge that some black slave owners developed genuine theological innovations that reflected their unique position in American society. Ideas about racial uplift, Christian stewardship, and divine providence were often more sophisticated among black religious thinkers than their white counterparts. To be fair, the religious communities that black slave owners belonged to sometimes provided the only spaces where they could discuss the moral implications of their economic choices. Church meetings, prayer groups, and religious societies became forums for working through ethical dilemmas that couldn't be addressed in secular settings. Of course, the children of black slave owners were often raised with religious education that had to somehow reconcile Christian teachings with family participation in slavery. This religious instruction created lasting psychological conflicts that affected their spiritual development throughout their lives. Meanwhile, let's examine how black slave owners used religious holidays and observances in managing their enslaved workers. Christmas bonuses, Easter celebrations, and Sunday rest periods were often more generous among black owners, reflecting both religious conviction and strategic management decisions. And yet, these religious observances could also become tools of control and manipulation. Enslaved people who violated religious rules or failed to demonstrate appropriate Christian behavior could face punishment that was justified in theological rather than purely economic terms. By the 1850s, the religious life of black slave owners had become a complex mixture of genuine faith, psychological defense, and strategic adaptation. If you thought religion would provide clear moral guidance about human ownership, the historical record proves that faith can be adapted to justify almost any social arrangement when the economic incentives are strong enough. Let's be clear about the ultimate religious irony. Many black slave owners believed they would meet their enslaved workers in heaven as equals, even while maintaining their earthly dominance through legal ownership. This theological compartmentalization allowed them to maintain both Christian faith and human property without experiencing complete psychological breakdown.